Really great to have so many folks here with us today. Welcome to a program we're calling Building Sustaining Inclusive Organizations. My name is Greg Riedman. I'm president of the Charles River Chamber, and I wanted to begin by thanking our sponsors of all our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programming this year: Direct Federal, Insource Services, and William James College. They all sponsor these kinds of programs and events because they really believe in this mission and the goal. And I gotta guess that most of you who are here with us today do as well. And I think this is a very important discussion, especially because in the last couple of years, we've seen a decline in those diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging conversations and work lately. Maybe it's because of budget constraints. Maybe it's because we're exhausted from it. Maybe it's political pressure, and I think we've seen a lot of that lately, or it's because we don't know where to start. So one of the reasons that we at the Chamber have repeatedly turned to the folks at Insource, who've hosted some number of webinars for us over the years, is that they've really been good at giving us guidance on these matters, and giving us not just, explaining to us why we need to do it. I think most of you understand that value, but really giving us a roadmap for moving forward. So I'm guessing you know why it matters. Let's see how we can get there. And I'm really delighted to have our two presenters today, Siobhan and Elizabeth from Insource Services. I'll let them say hello and take it from here. Just one note, if you have comments or questions or whatever, put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them as the program moves on. So welcome, Siobhan. Elizabeth, it's all yours.
Thank you, Greg. I will share my screen here. Everybody can see this. Yes. Classic question.
Yep.
I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Elizabeth Stasiowski, a senior finance and accounting manager at Insource. I've been with the company for coming up on 9 years. Member, it's hard to believe. Member of the leadership team at Insource in my capacity as a lead of one of our 3 teams in the finance practice. But the role that brings me here to this conversation today is that I co-chair our internal DEI committee with the wonderful Siobhan, who you will learn to be the real MVP of this session. Siobhan, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yep, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Siobhan Andrews. I am the team lead and senior HR consultant at Insource. I'll be here 3 years, April 9th. Woohoo, it's moving up. And I'm super excited to be here today, and we're gonna have a good time. We just want to make sure you guys realize that we want this to be kind of not just us talking at you. We want, if there's any questions or anything, any feedback or experiences you've experienced that you'd like to share, we would love to hear that from you as well.
Great, thanks. So I'll give you just a 2-second spiel on who we are and what we do. I know we have some clients in the room and some longtime partners that already know us, but for those of you that don't, we are Insource Services. We are a consulting firm. We're located in Wellesley, although we are largely remote at this point and have staff coast to coast and in Puerto Rico in our new post-pandemic virtual world. We have 3 main practice areas of consulting: finance, HR, and IT. We also have a growing and exciting data solutions department, as well as a recruiting arm where we do staff recruitment for organizations. We provide outsourced consulting services ranging from small a la carte positions up to a full department outsource. We also do assessments in all 3 of our practice areas, as well as DEI assessments, and have a large catalog and always growing of trainings that we offer in our core practice areas, as well as in the DEI space and management and leadership, communication, et cetera. So we are, unlike a staffing organization, we are truly approach this with a consultative approach, integrate with our clients, seek to learn how their businesses operate, and really become a core part of our clients. That's 2 seconds about us. The agenda topics today are Here, we're going to look very quickly at sort of how did we get here. Greg, thank you so much for that introduction, sort of overview of how the DEI conversation has cooled a bit and why, although there's still a really strong business case for it. Talk a little bit about some of the key factors in building an inclusive company and fostering a culture of belonging. And then Siobhan will take us through a whole bunch of meat and potatoes on qualitative and quantitative indicators, how to assess your own organizations individually for how well you're doing this work, some best practice guidelines, and then finish up with a little bit about metrics and KPIs. All right. So how did we get to where we are today? Obviously, the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion dates back long before 2020. But in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, among many others, it set off a wave of racial unrest in our country. Corporate America responded swiftly with renewed public commitments to DEI. We saw a lot of DEI positions being created. We saw committees being formed. This concept of DEI became somewhat of a buzzword, right, across the business landscape. Pledges to hire more people of color. Branding was removed that was perceived to be racist. And these efforts were largely met with widespread public support, right? There was a sort of racial reckoning that exposed systematic inequities in our society and really sought to correct those. However, 4 years later, we are here, and in large part, DEI efforts are being put on the back burner, right? So we're seeing some conversation fatigue. We're seeing some political pressures. We're seeing a lack of follow through or an inability to sustain some of those policies that were initially enacted. And we're seeing additionally some culture shifts. We are also seeing some outright, I would say, attack on the infrastructure itself. Talking about banned books, public schools being forbidden to teach critical race theory or discuss what we call divisive concepts. We have Elon Musk and billionaire Bill Ackman, who wrote recently this 4,000 word opus and published it against DEI, calling DEI itself an inherently racist and illegal movement. Talking about DEI as standing for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination, right? So we're seeing sort of a shift here. However, at the same time, despite the public backlash that we are seeing, in part, in addition to the conversation fatigue and the stall out of efforts, the business case itself remains really strong, right? So there's this continued shift towards creating companies that are inclusive and create a culture of belonging. Statistically, companies that are utilizing DEI and doing that work well outperform companies without DEI initiatives by 69%. And I just want to pause for a moment before we start looking at this to just sort of name and normalize the inherent complexity in this work. Some of us might be here because we have a personal passion for the work and have raised our hand to volunteer to serve in this capacity in our organizations. And some people might be here because it was delegated to us as a part of our responsibility centers of our job. There has been a notion of that DEI work is HR work, right? And is relegated to HR departments across companies. And a little bit of what that does is make it a them problem rather than an everybody solution. And so I just want to normalize and name that it is a process of learning, that we make mistakes, we make missteps along the way. You know, as a white person doing this work, it is certainly not lost on me the gravity and the importance of doing this work. And I spend a lot of time thinking about allyship and what it means to be an ally and sort of how best to do this work. And I make mistakes and missteps all the time. Yesterday, Siobhan can attest to it. I put my foot right on into my mouth in one of our monthly DEI committee meetings, and Siobhan, in her wonderful way, swiftly and lovingly redirected. and was able to do that. And I'm able to hear that feedback because we've created that culture internally. So
Before we move on
Yeah.
real quick, I just wanted to just raise your hand. How many are in the audience that are agreeing with what we are seeing? So what we're feeling and we're seeing at our clients, is that an agreement that everyone is feeling the DEI fatigue and the exhaustion? Okay.
Somewhat.
Somewhat.
Our company, Cambridge Savings Bank,
Mhm.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we have, put a full court press on for the last few years, and
Okay.
we're still maintaining that. So we're very focused on DE&I.
That's excellent. As we continue to talk through, I'd love for you to unmute and share also with us some of the things that you've done if you don't hear it throughout our presentation today. Thank you so much for engaging with us. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, that I.
No, at any point, please, Siobhan, and anybody, all of you. So we look statistically at the difference that having an inclusive organization can make, right? 73% more likely to be able to be in an innovative organization and turn that innovation into revenue. 70% more likely to capture new markets, 50% more likely to make better decisions, 36% more likely to have above average profitability. So these sort of statistics speak for themselves, right? And one of the things that referencing a study that Harvard Business Review put out just recently in September, they found that the leadership itself play a highly critical role in being able to create an inclusive culture within the organization. They account for a difference of up to 70 percentage points in an employee's experience of belongingness and psychological safety, which I know you will hear Siobhan talk about a lot as soon as we turn things over to her. And inclusive leaders see significant improvement in team performance, in decision-making, in team collaboration, and possibly most importantly, 76% reduction in attrition risk, which is, we know the cost of employee attrition is more than just monetary, right? And so what we have found is that there are 5 key behaviors that inclusive leaders employ in order to create this culture of inclusion, right? And they are here, and I'll walk through them. So this first is that inclusive leaders strive for authenticity over leadership presence. There's this sort of old notion that to be viewed as a leader, you must have this sort of air of superiority and infallibility, when in fact, truly inclusive leaders are prioritizing authenticity and psychological safety over this presence of greatness, right? And they're doing this by modeling curiosity, modeling humility, modeling vulnerability, normalizing ownership of mistakes, normalizing missteps. Some examples of this can be leaders that sort of openly share about their own failures along the way, or their own stumbling blocks on their career path, or members of a team that have created a culture where it is okay to disagree with one another, right? Where it's a space where you are free to air a dissenting opinion without fear of backlash, right? This concept of creating a sense of ownership rather than buy-in.
I just wanted to just quickly just to tie in that last the slide before, as we were saying that the diversity, equity, inclusion has been changing, the language has been changing, and so now we're not necessarily focused on the D and the I so much, and so we're now moving towards this inclusion and belonging. So now it used to be D, E, and I, and now you're starting to see DEIB language. Sometimes you're seeing DEIA, which is for accessibility, and DEIJ for justice. So I just wanted to just make sure I was making a good transition from where we were to where we're going. And so where we're going is to talking about being more inclusive, and how do we create a sense of belonging, that sense of belonging culture in our organizations. So that's been the focus. And that's why Elizabeth is going on. What does it take to have that inclusive and belonging culture? So I just wanted to.
Elizabeth, before you let me interrupt, there was a question about the statistics that you showed earlier, the percentages of how it's good for your business. Where do those come from?
Oh, I can send that source out, Greg. It's the study that the Harvard Business Review published, and I can send that out to you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
All right. Second key behavior is that inclusive leaders seek to redefine the rules rather than unquestioningly following them. So not afraid to challenge well-established or long-running practices that may or may not have outlived their relevance, right? So some examples of this might be looking at dress code policies, specifically as they pertain to hair or tattoos. Another example is an audit CPA firm that looked at their policy for pathway to partnership within the organization and removed the requirement that you be a full-time employee in order to become a partner, because what they found was that it tended to penalize working mothers, which were the demographic that largely made up their part-time employees. And so by sort of constantly re-examining and looking at those practices and asking the question of, are these inclusive practices, or are these policies and procedures that might be excluding a certain portion of our business, they're able to create a more inclusive culture. The third key behavior is that inclusive leaders embrace active learning and consistent implementation. They understand that this notion of creating an inclusive culture is actively learned. It's not passively acquired. I talked a little bit earlier about allyship, and there are a myriad of definitions on what it means to be an ally and the concept of allyship. But one thing that they all tend to have in common is this implied action, right? That it is more than a noun or an adjective, that allyship is a verb and requires educating oneself, listening, supporting inclusive practices, interrupting bias, making mistakes, being open to feedback, that it's an iterative approach. So for example, we can't just hope to, so example for Insource, for example, we happen to have two practice areas that traditionally have a gender stereotype, right? So we can't sit by and hope to have more women in IT or more men in HR. We have to look at the way that we are recruiting and make intentional, systematic process changes to the way in which we're recruiting and hiring. Another example might be coaching managers in terms of how to facilitate feedback giving, holding managers accountable for their direct reports' career development, book discussions, ongoing training. So one of the things we did at Insource back about 4 years ago, I think, is that we decided we wanted company-wide to have a common language and understanding around these topics. And so we brought in a firm that specializes in this work, and we did a mandatory company-wide training. And we are redoing that training I think it's every year with the new cohort of people, so that we all have this sort of common language around how to talk about DEI initiatives and how to think about the work. The fourth key behavior that we found is that inclusive leaders ensure equal opportunity and equitable outcomes, right? So this notion of the difference between equality and equity being everybody gets the same thing, equity being everybody gets what they need. And if you want to take it a step further, there's justice, which is changing the system itself, which is a much more daunting prospect, right? So inclusive leaders are acknowledging individuals' particular needs, looking for invisible obstacles, right? So some examples of this, of ways to institute this, are making sure that everybody has an opportunity to be heard, right? Rotating who has a speaking role in an organization, training managers to have coaching conversations for staff. So there's a difference between training somebody on the technical aspects of their job and coaching somebody on soft skills. And I think not everybody necessarily comes in knowing how to coach staff. So one of the things that we do at Insource that has worked really well is we have what we call Insource University. And we identify who are the emerging leaders at our organization and training them on things like having difficult conversations, active listening, delivering feedback, right? We also make sure to amplify voices and share credit. So an idea might be to not only train managers on how to deliver feedback, but train team members on how to ask for a raise, how to get a career development plan, how to obtain buy-in from managers, this concept of managing up, et cetera. And the last key behavior that they found was one of the biggest impacts here is that leaders view DEI as a collective responsibility, right? It is not an HR problem. It's not a them problem. It is an everybody solution. And in order to create a truly inclusive environment, we need everybody to be invested in it. And so organizations have found ways to truly solidify this into the DNA of the organization. So at Insource, we have a public statement on our website. One of the things that we do and have not stopped doing, even though we've grown from 40 staff to almost 200, is that we have everybody's headshot and bios on our website, not just leadership. And I can't tell you how many candidates I interview that will comment on it and say, one of the reasons I'm interested in joining Insource is I went to your website and I saw so many people that look like me in managerial positions, and I've never seen that before. Our DEI committee created a mission statement and a vision statement that we shared throughout the whole organization, and we have a landing page on our company's intranet where we post all of the things that we're doing, post our mission statement, post our vision statement, try to stay true to that, et cetera. And when you're embedding this notion of DEI as a sort of guiding value of your entire organization, the other thing it can do is prevent the sort of loudest, most passionate voices. If those folks move on from your organization, it doesn't dismantle all of this work that you've done, right? That it remains sort of core to who you are as a company and what you value, right? I think sometimes inclusion can be misperceived as this idea of just going easy on people or being nice to everybody or acquiescing to everybody's whims. But there are so many tangible benefits that being an inclusive company can deliver to everybody, right? Challenges folks to come up with new ways to work with people that are different than them, generates different methods of getting things done. And it leading inclusively, I think it's not necessarily intuitive, right? It calls for action, it calls for courage, it calls for ingenuity. But when it's practiced intentionally, and I think most importantly, adaptively, right? We're changing this over time, where it's not a sort of set it and forget it model, can elevate employee well-being and business outcomes as well.
Elizabeth, Don has asked in the chat, when I have led efforts to change an organizational culture, I've started with first understanding the existing culture and identifying strengths to build on and weaknesses to change. Can you go right to solutions with your DEI efforts?
Yes, we can. Siobhan, take it away.
So, Don, I'm going to go over some quantitative and qualitative indicators. What you're saying is you go into the organization and you first try to identify what's going well and what's the areas of opportunity. And that is what most folks do. I mean, and that's what you're going to see as we talk through this. You first do a DEI assessment or DEIB assessment to see what's happening in your organization, and then find out where's the areas of opportunity. And we're going to talk about that some more as we go through these slides. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure I answered you, Don. Thank you for your question. All right, so now we're going to go on to talking a little bit about quantitative and qualitative indicators that will show your DEIB program success. So a lot of us know those quantitative indicators, which is analyzing our hiring outcomes. Who's coming through our doors? Pay equity. Do we have a pay equity officer? Do we have a pay equity plan in our organizations? What is our employee experience? How does the employee feel from onboarding all the way to offboarding? What is the experience, and what is the experience for the dimensions of diversity of the employees in your organization? And then the next quantitative one is retention and attrition, right? So what are your retention trends, and how is that affecting your DEIB? And then last, for quantitative, we're going to talk about finding out what identities are joining and succeeding in your company, right? So anybody that's coming into your organization, they want to be successful and they want to be thriving. So we want to make sure that we find out which identities are joining and what are successful and what are those barriers. The next indicator is the qualitative indicators. And these are the things that speak to your everyday employee experience. For me, I feel like the qualitative indicators are definitely where you can attract your teammates. And this is where you get the biggest impact. And this is why people stay, right? So it's really important. We do a lot of these initiatives. I train a lot of how do we hire diverse staff but how do we get them in our doors, and then how to retain them? And one of the best ways to do so is by looking at the qualitative indicators. But I am going to also go through both indicators during this. Is there any questions? Next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to add, so that the same study that I referenced before also found that 25% of people do not feel a sense of belonging in their organizations. And those are the qualitative indicators that Siobhan is speaking to, and how it's so important to measure those and identify where those feelings are coming from.
Yep. And that really comes from that whole psychological safety that you hear so frequently. But I just wanted to go over the quantitative indicators of how we measure DEIB success, looking at demographics across hiring stages, looking at the demographics of your new hires, basically looking at your demographics of all your staff, right? That's how you measure your DEIB success quantitatively. What is the demographic diversity across the levels of organization of your organization? So when you look at your C-suite, middle management, frontline staff, what do the demographics look like? Are we heavy on our top staff? Is it heavily Caucasian? And all of our frontline staff are all minorities of people of color? What do we need to do to change that? What does it look like for your organization? Every organization is going to look a little bit different. What is the language that we're using in our organization? Do we have problematic slang that we use? Do we have gender, tone issues, age issues? So we want to make sure we're talking the same language. Are we using pronouns? Are we not using programs? Are we making everyone feel part of the team? DEI training and programming participation. Do you offer DEI training, and do people come? Is it a DEI training that you have to make mandatory and force people in the seats? Or is the culture one where, when the DEI training is coming up, people are excited and to come to the DEI training? Do you do surveys after your DEI training to see what information the staff retained from it? And then after the DEI training, what's next? What happens next? How do you continue that conversation? Pay equity is always going to be an issue that is a way to, and as a quantitative indicator to see how well you're doing with your DEIB success. If you have a pay equity officer, that's a very good start. But pay is important to make sure that across the board equitably, that folks within the dimensions of diversity are paid equitably. What do your promotion rates look based on demographics? Yes, people are getting promoted, but who's getting promoted? Is it men, women, folks of color, non-folks of color? What does that look like for your organization? What does retention look like? And then the biggest thing for me as an HR professional is making sure you review your HR systems, your handbooks, your policies, your job descriptions. Whenever you're trying to measure your DEIB success, it's really important to make sure that you look at the systems in your organizations to see where there are areas of opportunity. I always recommend, either having someone on the outside come in and do a DEI assessment because you don't know what you don't know, right? What is happening within our organization and our systems. And then once you're able to identify and review your systems, then you can go on to measuring your other entities as well. Any questions on any of the measurements I just reviewed? Anything a surprise to anyone?
Could I ask a question?
You sure can.
Just curious about tracking demographics, since it seems like ones that are more easily tracked are potentially race, gender, and age.
Mhm.
Are there others that you're thinking about? Because I think other things would probably be on like a disclosure basis.
Well, when I say when I'm talking about the dimensions of diversity of employee, you can also, so on here I also put like levels of the organization. That's another demographic that you can look at. Like, are they C-suite? Are they middle management? Is that answering your question?
Yeah, I guess it's how do we capture the best sort of, how to capture the best picture of the current demographic makeup, if you will. Because I think certain things are more easily tracked than others.
So what I usually advise people to do is come up with a demographic survey so that they can survey their organizations and survey their staff members and have them self-identify. So what typically you would do is come up with a demographic survey for your staff and see where everyone self-identifies, and then you can take that demographic information and then plug it in and work within your demographics. So then people have identified themselves, who they are, where they are. Don? Thank you, Cecilia. Don, I see your hand up. Donna, you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Unmute.
There
Can
you
you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, Don.
It seems to me that this measurement is kind of a very long-term effort. You don't change demographics very quickly. You don't change attitudes very quickly. What kind of time frame might you be talking about to have an effective measurement?
Well, it all depends on where you are in your organization, right? It depends on how do you want to prioritize things. So there isn't I can't just say this is going to take a year, this is going to take 2 years. It all depends on how you prioritize and where you're starting from, right? So if you have a good handbook or your policies are pretty much inclusive already, but if you're starting from scratch, it's going to probably take a little bit longer. But I do have, when we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about some qualitative indicators that are things that you see a quicker impact, right? So yes, this is going to take a while. I don't have an exact number. It all depends on where you are in your DEIB journey at your organization. But it's a journey, right? So you'll go from starting out somewhere, wherever you decide to start out, and then as you start out, you create your plan and you build upon your plan.
Thank you.
You're welcome. John?
Hey, thank you for giving me a moment. So my question, and you might answer this further on, I was going to give it some time, but somebody had asked about sort of more difficult inclusivity demographics to include. So I oversee a program that helps adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people on the autism spectrum to find careers. So I guess, and I'm very lucky, I'm in the human services world. We've been in the DEI path for way beyond, I've been doing this for 15 years. And since the beginning, I work for an agency that's been very dedicated to this. But I'm wondering how much of your conversations with the companies that you are providing services to include intellectual and developmental disabilities, and what is Insource themselves? Are there people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or people that are identifying as being on the autism spectrum working in your Wellesley office? And is that something that you guys are dedicated to or working with agencies like ours to try to provide access for?
Okay, so I don't know the entire demographics at Insource, so I'm not 100% sure. We're a very inclusive organization. I don't know for sure if we have anyone on staff with accessibility or any of those issues. I do not know, so I don't want to lie. But we are a very inclusive organization, and but we do work with several organizations that are similar to your organization. What was the first? You asked the first part of the question, and I missed it. Trying to because I was trying to think about my staff at Insource.
Yeah, so my first part of the question is, as you're sort of guiding other companies that you're providing your service to, are people with disabilities included in that DEI perspective? Because in my work, I think that they're often excluded, and I think diversity is really important. But I think the thing about the disabilities, especially intellectual and developmental disabilities, this is a group of people a community of people who have challenges advocating for themselves, where other communities can advocate for themselves. So I think it's really important for us to include them in this conversation. And I'm just kind of curious how much of that comes up in your work.
Well, yeah, it comes up a lot. In the beginning slides, it wasn't on the screen, but on 2022, that's when a lot of it went from DEIB to DEIA to include the accessibility piece. So yes, accessibility has been an important part of this DEI work, and some people actually have it named as DEIA. DEBIA. I mean, there's so many different versions of it, but accessibility is key to this whole diversity conversation. And we talk about that a lot, and we do a course called Dimensions of Diversity, and there's just a breakdown of like, there are so many dimensions of diversity outside of race, ethnicity, age, right? There's organizational, there's internal. So yes, John, and if you'd like, we could have additional conversations, but we gotta keep moving forward so that we can get to the qualitative indicators. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm sure you probably were going to bring this up anyways, but I would love the opportunity to talk more about it if you guys have the chance. Thank you.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Elizabeth, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was just going to add to John. So one of the things that the DEI committee did last year was we launched affinity groups, sometimes known as employee resource groups. And there was one individual on staff who is, she moved on from the organization. She's no longer with us, but she was interested in starting an affinity group for neurodivergent individuals. Now, the affinity groups, the model that we have employed is that they are employee led and generated. So if there are people that are interested in starting one, we are supportive of that. So it never did get started, but had it, we would have certainly been 100% open to that if there had been a group of people that wanted to do that as well.
We just talked about that yesterday. We were trying to figure out who wanted to start it, then we realized the person wasn't there. So we're like, we're gonna hold off on it until we find a person to lead it, but we definitely, that is another way to encompass the accessibility within an affinity group.
Well, if you guys ever want somebody to come talk to your organization about how to do it well, I'm happy to do that.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate you. Thank you so much. All right. Any other questions or anybody want to add anything in? Want to be inclusive. All right. So now we get to the fun part of the qualitative indicators. There are 5 ways to measure an inclusive culture. So who's speaking up? Like, in a meeting, who's speaking up and who's not speaking? That'll be that's a quick way to measure your DEIB measures, right? So if you're sitting in a room and there's 13 participants and, the person of color or the women are not speaking, there may be a problem, right? What do you do when folks aren't speaking? Do you bring them into the conversation, or do you allow them to just be on their own island? If you allow them to be on their own island, they'll stay on their own island and they'll eventually leave. And so all those efforts that you made to bring them all in, that goes out the door, right? So who's speaking up in your organization and who's not? Who used to speak and now all of a sudden they're not speaking? There's a reason, right? The person may feel like they were brought into an organization, they felt like they had psychological safety, they felt inclusion, they felt a sense of belonging, and then the honeymoon phase ends and they're like, oh, I no longer feel like I can speak. Okay, if they don't feel like they can speak, eventually they will leave your organization. So you don't want it. We all know it takes a lot to hire and bring in all these diverse staff. So we want to make sure that we're creating psychological safety and that we're doing these qualitative and indicative checks on ourselves throughout the day, throughout the week, to make sure that we are that the people coming into our building feel a sense of belonging. They feel the psychological safety. They want to continue to work there. Who's showing up? Who's showing up to your events? Who's showing up to your buildings? Who in the community is active with your organization? If it's not a diverse group of folks, how can you make it more diverse? How can you make because the people who are in your buildings who are diverse, they want to make sure that that they're dealing with folks that look like them as well, right? So who's showing up and how are they showing up? What are people saying about your organization and your DEIB culture, your inclusive culture? What are the people saying when they leave your doors, right? So it's really important who's speaking up, who's showing up. If an employee comes in, they feel a sense of psychological safety, and so they're the great advocate and cheerleader to bring other folks in. The moment they lose that psychological safety or they don't feel a sense of belonging, they become the person that goes out into the community and talks about, I'm not really sure about that organization. And so you don't want to ruin your brand, right? So what are people saying? Have you checked your Glassdoor? Glassdoor tells a big story about your DEIB or your inclusive culture or your sense of belonging. People have no problem telling you that they didn't feel part of the team. And other folks will go to Glassdoor and say, oh, that's what they're saying about Insource. That's what they say about X client. I don't think I want to go there. One of the things that folks do, they go to your website while they're interviewing, and it's like you're saying all these wonderful things. Our organization is diverse, we're inclusive, it's going to be great. And so the person of color or the person that's trying to come into your organization, they go and look on your website and they're like, does it look like there's anybody that looks like me, right? Then the next step is like, okay, let me go to Glassdoor. What are people saying about them? Let me talk to a former employee. Why did you leave? Did you feel safe, right? So you want to make sure that you're having these kind of conversations. And what's actually working when what's your DEIB programs and your inclusion? What's really working and what's not really working? The one thing that I love that we did at Insource is a year ago, we were like Reverend and we're like, we're going to keep going. And Elizabeth and I had all these wonderful ideas. We're going to do a mentorship. We're going to start ERGs. We're going to do all these things. And we wrote it all down. And then it was like, well, wait a minute. We haven't started a mission. We don't have a mission. We don't have a vision. What is the purpose of this group? So then we decided, okay, all of our passion and excitement is wonderful, but where are we bringing these group of people to? So then we decided to sit back and then say, okay, let's create a vision. Let's get folks together. And what exactly do we want our DEIB committee to look like? And what's actually working and what's not working? And one of the scariest things is to, do the surveys and then hear from folks like, yeah, all that work that you were doing, that's not what we wanted to do, right? So you want to make sure that you're constantly checking in with your group. So we're now a year into our reset and level set. And so then actually, as we were creating this PowerPoint, Elizabeth and I said, wow, you know what? We probably should do another level set and reevaluate our program. And I mean, we celebrated, our wins, but then it's also like, we wanted to move forward and okay, let's do mentorship. Let's do this, let's do that. But it was let's first check back with the staff and the people that we're impacting to see, did you enjoy our affinity groups? Are the affinity groups, do we have the right affinity groups? Do we have the right people in the right seats? Are we creating the psychological safety that we told you we were going to be creating? What else do you need to hear? What else would you like to see, right? Because when you're doing these programs, you want to make sure it's actually what the employees want or what your clients want. You don't want to just do what Siobhan wants or what Elizabeth wants. Actually, you want to have a big impact.
One of the things, it's actually two sort of concrete examples of how we do this. One of the things that we try to do are stay interviews. So we certainly do exit interviews. I think that's pretty common practice to find out why folks are leaving the organization. But we also try to do stay interviews to find out why folks are staying at the organization. And sometimes information in those is equally as powerful as the information gleaned from an exit interview. So that's one good strategy. And the other thing that we do when Siobhan was talking about this idea of who's speaking up, who's not, something that we do in our leadership team meetings that some of us love it, some of us hate it, but it's a great way to be inclusive about seeking feedback from folks that might not be as comfortable speaking up, right? So some of us are more outgoing personalities. Siobhan is one of them. I'm another. I typically don't hesitate to share my opinion. Some of us might not be just as outgoing. So often when we're discussing a new policy that we're thinking about or a new procedure that we're thinking about, we do this thing called Fist to Five. And we pause in the discussion and everybody does it's like a 0 to, vehemently opposed to all in and everywhere in between. And often folks that might, not quite know how to verbalize their opinion or might not feel totally comfortable verbalizing their opinion, can still do a fist of 5, and then you get a snapshot of where everybody is on the spectrum. Are we all in alignment? We can move on, or do we need to have more discussion? So that's a good sort of example of something that's worked for us.
Elizabeth, let's keep going. We only have 13.
Got it.
All right. So how do you review your DEIB initiative in 4 easy steps? All right. We're going to talk about, I talked a little bit about running frequent diversity surveys. So, can you go back real quick?
Yep, sorry.
So we talked about running the diversity surveys. We're going to talk quickly about how you can leverage your performance and review process. How do you examine your internal mobility? And then last but not least, Elizabeth's going to end with talking about metrics and data. All right, so if you would love to know more about what's happening at your organization, I say run pulse engagement surveys, right? And a pulse engagement survey is exactly what it is in order for you to drive your diversity across the company, you need to have effective surveys. This survey should inquire about the company's culture, the team's dynamics, the leadership, and the DEIB initiative. This is really good, especially because a lot of us are remote and hybrid. So you want to consider what DEI efforts are working well and where there are areas of opportunity. There are several DEIB or engagement surveys that you can find online, but you can also, work with folks within your organizations to come up with something that would work best for your team. Yes, Erin.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to quickly add to this idea of a pulse survey. The
Yes.
last place that I worked, we had them weekly.
Oh, nice.
And it was done through a Google form. It was very easy. The problem with it, they were trying to change the culture. It was not a good culture. And the problem with it was that they were mandatory. And the supervisor would come to you and say, I don't have your pulse check yet. If you hadn't done it, you were required to score yourself. How well do you think you're doing in your work? Give yourself a number value that your supervisor is then going to review with you and say whether they think you're correct at how you're doing on your performance and so forth. Anyway, the point is that it can be implemented very badly if the culture isn't already authentic, as you said.
I love that. Thank you, Erin. That is absolutely correct, right? You want to make sure that these engagement surveys are authentic and they're not forced. Mandatory, whether you make a survey mandatory or not, does affect the mood of the survey, right? And what people are writing. So if the employee engagement surveys show a negative outlook on your DEIB initiatives, you can use those insights to help direct, like, how you're going to change it. What do you need to go next? You can keep going, Elizabeth. So I'm an HR person, so I'm always going to talk about leveraging performance and peer reviews. There are 5 ways to gather the best insight from your reviews. Audit your current performance review process. Make sure that it's inclusivity, where the employee is allowed to actually express their concerns and the supervisor, so it's more of a conversation. Align leadership on bias in performance views. I always loved with my clients, whenever it's performance review time, I like to have a sit-down conversation with the leadership team to review the performance evaluations and reviews and talk about where bias can creep in and have an actual conversation, because it's important for us to understand our own biases and understand that it's okay, but what do we need to do to make sure that the bias doesn't show up when doing the performance evaluations for staff? Set goals for your performance reviews. What insights you want to walk away with? What do I want the employees or the staff to walk away with at the end of the performance review? Make the process collaborative. I think I said that a little bit earlier. Make sure it's collaborative. You don't want the employees to feel like this is just their supervisor coming down. It has to be an inclusive, collaborative conversation, creating a sense of belonging for the employees. And then also, you want to make sure you get buy-in from the employees, and having a training that explains the performance evaluation and performance reviews, what the goals are, the why, and how, and making sure that it's prevalent that the audience and the staff understand that this will be an unbiased performance, and this is how we're going to do that.
Another thing that we do in our internal performance review process is that it's a two session model, where the initial session is the conversation, and it is just that, it's a conversation. There's not like a scoring rubric and rate everybody 1 to 5 on all of these criteria, et cetera. And then the employee receiving the feedback is then tasked with writing up the notes. And then the two folks come back together, and that is a way to ensure that what you as the manager said was received in the way that you had intended it to be received, because sometimes there can be a disconnect. And that's been a really nice way to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Words have different meanings to everyone, so it's really good to do that temperature check. Like, oh, so what did you mean when you said X, Y, and Z? What did you mean by that? Thank you. Anita, I see a question there.
Yeah, real quick. Number 5 says get buy-in from your employees, and one of the favorite things I've heard so far today is go for ownership rather than. So I'm just mentioning it. Loved that.
I love
Thank
it. Note to self: we're going to change that on our next slide. Thank you, Anita. Ownership is very important. Thank you. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yep.
Oh, and the last thing that I'm going to talk about with you today is examining your internal mobility. Internal mobility helps your teams and organization become more agile and efficient in moving and develop existing employees so that they grow and thrive, right? Our employees are our number one, our best asset in our organization. So making sure that you examine your internal mobility, your ability to develop the existing folks in the organization. It will help you to drive diversity and inclusion initiatives by creating equitable processes. You can use your feedbacks from your one-on-one along with career progression frameworks to provide insight and sentiment around your internal mobility, and then use hiring and retention data that'll help to determine the team members fit into a new hierarchy and the team culture. It's real. I know I'm kind of going fast because we only have 7 minutes, but doing that pulse and examining your internal mobility is a key point that a lot of people skip. But it's something simple that you can do, right? It's very simple to try to figure out, how can I promote the folks that are internally in our organization, and how can I make a roadmap for them? And then they feel valued. They feel like they have a voice at the table.
And also do that not only for the individuals who are really vocal about their desire to do that, but for the individuals that might not be so comfortable is asking for that, right? Make sure you're bringing everybody along equally. All right. Okay, so now that you've done your internal assessment, you've measured all your quantitative demographics, you've done the survey, you have a bunch of really good qualitative demographics. Now, what do we do with that, right? So we want to use those metrics to both assess our baseline and also to act, right? We don't know what initiatives are going to be the most important for our organization until we have a set baseline. So creating KPIs or key performance indicators around DEI is really important to not only decide what initiatives you want to focus on first, because you can't do it all at once, right? Then it becomes overwhelmed, and everything seems less important rather than more important. And also to measure your success over time and alter if need be, right? So the KPIs are going to look different for every organization, depending on the type of business you have, what your demographics are, et cetera. Your pulse surveys and your initial quantitative data collection, that will establish your baseline. Your KPIs will establish and help you measure and track against your goals, right? Allows you to monitor trends. That allows you to measure what is the impact of the conversations we are having. Have they had the intended impact that we want? Or perhaps they're having the reverse impact. We thought this one thing would be really, really great and it has backfired and everybody hates it. Okay, let's course correct, right? Mm-hmm. These KPIs should not be set in stone, right? This is, I think I said it before, it's not a set it and forget it, right? These should be adjusted accordingly as your business objective changes, as your teams grow, as your hiring goals pivot, et cetera. And then we recommend creating a dashboard. I'm going to show you just one example. It can look however you want. I'll show you one example, and share those results often, right? Not just internally within the DEI committee of those tasked with doing the work, but across the organization, right? Creates accountability, and some publicity around it, right? So how to create a dashboard. Consider your target user group, who's going to be looking at this dashboard. What are they going to be using it for? There's a whole bunch of qualitative and quantitative data points that you can have, as Siobhan just went through. What are the most important things that you want to put on this dashboard? So based on who is going to be using this, figure out what you want to include on there. Word of caution, choose the labels carefully, use inclusive language. We want male, female, non-binary, not male, female, other, right? As an example. Visualize the data in a user-friendly way. There are softwares available that will create these dashboards for you. You could also do it yourself. That investing in a software may or may not be worth it, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. Onboard the dashboard users so they can orient themselves to what it is that they're looking at, and then use it, right? Use it to drive change. Creating the KPIs and the goals are one thing, but then measuring that data and using that data to inform change is what we want to do. So here's a sample of a dashboard. One thing I like about this is that, so there's some quantitative data here with the company makeup by race, by gender, hires this year, and what dimension of diversity. Obviously, this is not measuring everything you could possibly measure. This is just one example. One thing I like about this one is it includes trend lines. So we're not just looking at a snapshot in time, we're looking at how things have changed over time. And then this one also includes ideally it would have more, but this does include one qualitative measure, which is this inclusion survey, right? And again, it has the trend over time. So in this example, you can see that our most recent survey was 92%, but it has been steadily increasing since, looks like, about 2017 in this. I think it's a big organization.
Elizabeth, really quick, I just want to, I want, before we have to go, I want to answer Alice. She says, would love to hear about fostering a sense of belonging / ownership for longtime staff or in nonprofit volunteer and board members who are strongly attached to org traditions that do not lead to diversity. So what anybody can answer that, right? What are some things that you have done to foster a sense of belonging or ownership for your longtime staff? Anybody in the audience? Sense of ownership for longtime staff?
It feels like two questions. One is like the long-term staff, help them to feel belonging. The other part feels like get them to let go of the organizational traditions that are in the way of other people feeling like they belong. So I'm not sure which is the genuine or the core question.
Yeah, I also think that creating a sense of belonging and ownership for the longtime staff, it's sometimes you just have to let people understand the why. Like, why are we here? Why do we want to create a sense of belonging? Why do we want to create psychological safety? And what are the reasons why we are doing this DEIB work? And if the long-term employees are sticking to the traditions that are not leading to diversity, how can we have a conversation and move that work forward so that they can lead more towards the diversity? But I think it's really important to explain the why to people, and then help them along with the process. Greg.
I have a question that Alice talked about.
Yes.
So she said, fostering a sense of belonging and ownership for longtime staff, and then talking about volunteers and board members who are strongly attached to the organization, traditions that did not lead to, strong DEI. So what does that mean exactly?
Can you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so one of the attendees made a great comment about, she wants to learn how to foster a sense of belonging and ownership for longtime staff or in nonprofits, volunteers, and board members.
Mhm.
So, and they're strongly attached to, you know, the organization's traditions or what they've been doing for so long, and it did not lead to diversity. So my first question is, what does that mean exactly? And I think that's really the main question.
Yeah.
Does that mean that it didn't lead to a diverse staff, or
Well, if Alice, if you're still here, and you're comfortable, piping up to clarify, but one of the things I'm guessing is that perhaps there are sort of longstanding practices in place that are not necessarily fostering diversity, but that folks are very attached to and reticent to change. And if so, I think, like I said in the beginning, it's a process and it's a learning journey. And I think some of that might require, like Siobhan said, the recentering on the why and some education.
there
Right.
she is? Okay, she's saying sometimes you can't have both. Right. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Elizabeth and Siobhan, first, thank you so much for this and everybody for participating. There was one, we are out of time, but I just wanted to squeeze this question in that was written in the chat, which is, has the affirmative action rulings from the Supreme Court that apply to the corporate setting? And do people need to think about those things?
Any lawyers in the house?
Okay. And if that's a more complicated question than we can do in 90 seconds or 30 seconds, I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an HR professional, so I don't want to speak to the question about liability, like organizational liability. I don't know if Siobhan, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have the exact answer to that. Just overall, yes, it has been a little bit more challenging with the affirmative action, but I don't know how much I haven't done enough research to know how much it has affected the movement of DEIB.
Great.
So I don't want to, but that's the best answer. Yes, it has affected. How much? I'm not really sure.
And what you need to do about it is something you need to consult your own attorneys and counsel.
Correct. Yes, that's the last part. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for this, the past hour, and everybody for participating. Thanks to Direct Federal, Insource, and William James for sponsoring all of our DEIB programming. I'm really grateful to both of you for your time today. And everybody have a great day.
Thanks for having us. Thank you. We appreciate you.